My name is Thaddeus Grimsby, and I'm a cave rescue specialist who survived the first 96 hours of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted and temperatures dropped 40 degrees in 3 days, I had two choices: freeze to death on the surface or disappear into Minneapolis's underground tunnel system, with nothing but 20 years of cave maps and a prayer. What I discovered down there changed everything I thought I knew about survival. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Thaddeus Grimsby, and I'm probably the only person alive who was actually prepared for the world to freeze over. But let me tell you something. Being prepared and being ready are two completely different things. I had spent 20 years as a cave rescue specialist here in Minnesota, pulling people out of collapsed mines, flooded caverns, and underground spaces that most folks never even knew existed. What started as a job became an obsession, and what most people thought was just a weird hobby turned out to be the only reason I'm still breathing today. You see, for the past decade, I had been mapping every tunnel, steam pipe, utility corridor, and forgotten passage beneath Minneapolis. My apartment walls were covered with hand-drawn schematics that traced the underground arteries of the city like some kind of subterranean circulatory system. My sister Sarah used to visit and shake her head at what she called my underground obsession. She would stand there looking at my maps and tell me I was using them as an excuse to avoid dealing with the real world above ground. She never understood that my work pulling people out of collapsed spaces had taught me something most people never learn. The surface world is fragile, and when it fails, you better know where to go underground. Sarah always said my maps were just an excuse to avoid dealing with the real world. Turns out the real world was the problem. Every weekend I would disappear into manholes, storm drains, and maintenance tunnels with my surveying equipment and sketchpad. I mapped steam distribution systems from the 1920s, Prohibition-era smuggling tunnels, Cold War-era fallout shelter connections, and modern utility corridors that most city workers had forgotten existed. My co-workers at the rescue service thought I was eccentric, but they respected the thoroughness of my documentation. They had no idea that I was creating what would become the most valuable survival resource in the state of Minnesota. I had pulled enough people out of collapsed mines to know what happens when the earth decides to remind you who's really in charge. In my line of work, you learn to read the signs of structural failure, environmental collapse, and human panic. You develop an instinct for when things are about to go very wrong very quickly. So when the emergency broadcast started on October 15th, 2024, at 3:47 in the afternoon Mountain Time, I was not thinking about it the same way most people were thinking about it. I was in my apartment on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse in downtown Minneapolis, about 6 blocks from the Mississippi River. The building had good bones, brick construction from 1910, but I knew exactly how those bones would hold up in extreme temperature fluctuations because I had seen what Minnesota winters could do to unprepared structures. I was sitting at my kitchen table updating my tunnel maps with measurements I had taken the previous weekend, when every phone in the building started screaming with that emergency alert tone that makes your blood freeze before you even hear the message. The first broadcast was standard government speak about a major volcanic event at Yellowstone National Park and recommendations for residents in affected areas to monitor local news for updates. Most people heard that and thought about airline delays or maybe some ash in the air. I heard it and immediately started calculating blast radius, ash cloud distribution patterns, and what a volcanic winter would do to surface temperatures across the northern plains. I had studied enough geological disasters in my rescue work to know that when Yellowstone goes off, you do not worry about airline delays. You worry about whether civilization is going to survive the next 6 months. Within 2 hours, the temperature outside my window had dropped from 52 degrees to 43 degrees. That might not sound like much, but I had been watching weather patterns for 2 decades, and 9-degree temperature drops in 2 hours do not happen naturally in mid-October. I grabbed my emergency weather radio and started monitoring National Weather Service broadcasts while pulling out my detailed maps of the Minneapolis underground tunnel system. I was not panicking, but I was preparing for something that I hoped would never happen. I spent that first night checking every entrance to the tunnel system within 6 blocks of my apartment. Call it paranoia, but paranoia keeps you alive. I located 4 different access points that I could reach within 5 minutes of leaving my building. I tested each manhole cover to make sure they were not frozen shut or blocked by debris. I verified that my key ring included the universal utility keys that would get me through locked maintenance doors. I double-checked my emergency supplies and made sure my camping gear was ready to go at a moment's notice. By the second day, October 16th, the temperature had dropped another 20 degrees overnight. I woke up to find frost covering my apartment windows, and when I checked the weather radio, I learned that similar temperature drops were being reported across the entire upper Midwest. The emergency broadcasts were becoming more frequent and more urgent, but they were still talking about temporary disruptions and advising people to stay indoors and conserve heating fuel. They were not telling people what I already knew from my years of disaster response work. When environmental conditions change this rapidly, infrastructure fails in ways that nobody is prepared to handle. I watched Mrs. Chen from apartment 2B scraping ice off her windshield with a kitchen knife, and I knew right then that everyone was thinking about this all wrong. They were trying to run from winter. You cannot outrun winter. Mrs. Chen was 73 years old, and she was trying to chip through a quarter-inch of ice that had formed overnight on her Honda Civic. She was wearing 3 winter coats, layered, on top of each other and moving with the careful deliberation of someone who knew that falling on ice at her age meant broken bones and possibly death. She worked at that ice for 20 minutes before giving up and heading back inside her building. I could see from my window that she was not the only one having problems. Cars all over the street were covered in ice thick enough to make driving dangerous, if not impossible. But the real problem was not the ice on the cars. The real problem was that the roads themselves were becoming impassable as water pipes began to freeze and burst, creating patches of ice that turned every intersection into a skating rink. Emergency vehicles were starting to have trouble responding to calls, and I could hear more sirens than usual, which meant that people were starting to get hurt and the systems designed to help them were beginning to fail. By noon on that second day, I realized that Mrs. Chen was not going to make it. I could not see any lights in her apartment windows after dark, and she had not tried to work on her car again. I thought about checking on her, but I also knew that I could not save everyone, and trying to save people who were already too far gone would just get me killed along with them. It sounds cold, but 20 years of rescue work teaches you to make those calculations quickly and without emotion. You save the people you can save, and you do not let guilt about the ones you cannot save get you killed before you can help anyone else. That second night, I sat in my apartment monitoring emergency broadcasts and updating my escape plans, while the temperature outside continued to drop. The power was still on, but it was flickering periodically, and I knew that electrical infrastructure was not designed to handle the kind of thermal stress that was building up across the region. Steam pipes were bursting, water mains were freezing, and natural gas lines were losing pressure as pumping stations lost power. I had seen this kind of cascading infrastructure failure before in natural disasters, but never on a scale that covered multiple states at the same time. The emergency broadcasts were still talking about temporary disruptions and advising people to conserve fuel and stay warm, but I could hear the strain in the voices of the emergency coordinators. They were reading from prepared scripts, but those scripts had been written for normal disasters like blizzards or ice storms that lasted a few days. Nobody had prepared scripts for what to do when the entire climate zone shifted 40 degrees in 72 hours. Nobody had contingency plans for when winter arrived in October and decided to stay until further notice. On the third day, October 18th, I woke up to discover that the power had failed completely sometime during the night. My apartment was the same temperature as the air outside, which according to my thermometer was negative 15 degrees Fahrenheit. I could see my breath inside my own kitchen, and when I tried to turn on the tap, nothing came out because the water pipes in the building had frozen solid. This was the moment I had been preparing for without really believing it would happen. The surface world had become uninhabitable, and anyone who stayed above ground was going to die. I stood at my apartment window that morning, looking down at the street, and what I saw confirmed everything I had feared. There were people outside, bundled in every piece of clothing they owned, trying to break into abandoned cars or smash their way into stores that had already been looted. But they were moving slowly, clumsily, and I could see that hypothermia was already affecting their coordination and judgment. Some of them had fallen and were just lying there in the snow, and I could not tell if they were resting or if they were already dead. The ones who were still moving were not going to be moving much longer. Mrs. Chen's car was still in the parking lot, but it was now encased in ice so thick that it looked like a sculpture. There were no lights visible in any of the apartment windows I could see, which meant that the power failure was widespread and probably permanent. The city snowplows had given up trying to clear the streets, and I could see several abandoned emergency vehicles that had slid off the road and been left behind by their crews. The organized response to this disaster had collapsed along with everything else. But the most disturbing thing I saw from my window that morning was not the abandoned cars or the people lying motionless in the street. The most disturbing thing was the smoke rising from several buildings in the distance, which meant that people were trying to heat their homes with improvised fires, and those fires were getting out of control. In normal winter conditions, the fire department would respond to those calls, but there was no fire department anymore. There was just smoke and flames spreading from building to building while the people inside either burned to death or froze to death, and nobody was coming to help them. I spent that third day making my final preparations for what I knew would be a one-way trip underground. I inventoried my supplies one more time and made hard decisions about what I could carry and what I would have to leave behind. Every ounce mattered when you were planning to walk an unknown distance through tunnels that might be flooded, collapsed, or occupied by other desperate people. I packed my camping gear, my emergency food supplies, my first aid kit, my utility, tools, and most importantly, my complete collection of hand-drawn tunnel maps that represented 10 years of underground exploration. I spread out 20 years' worth of tunnel maps on my kitchen table, and I was not looking at hobby sketches anymore. I was looking at the only road south that had not frozen over. The maps showed me a route that could theoretically take me from downtown Minneapolis to the airport, and from there to connections that might allow me to continue south toward warmer climates. But the maps also showed me all the places where the route was uncertain, where tunnels had been sealed or modified since my last survey, where structural integrity was questionable, and where I would be traveling through areas that I had never fully explored. The route I was planning would take me through steam distribution tunnels, storm drainage systems, utility corridors, and abandoned sections of the original city infrastructure that dated back to the late 1800s. Some of these passages were wide enough to walk upright, but others would require crawling through spaces barely large enough for a human body. Some were heated by steam pipes, but others would be as cold as the surface. Some had access to clean water, but others might be flooded with contaminated runoff. All of them were designed for maintenance workers, not for people trying to live in them for extended periods. But what worried me most about my tunnel maps was not what they showed. What worried me most was what they did not show. I had been mapping the underground systems of Minneapolis for 10 years, but the city had been building and modifying those systems for over a century. There were connections I had never found, passages I had never explored, and structural modifications that had been made without updating any public records. I was planning to bet my life on maps that I knew were incomplete, and if I guessed wrong about a route or missed a critical connection, I would end up trapped underground with no way out. That third night, sitting in my freezing apartment, I made the decision that would either save my life or kill me. I was going underground, and I was heading south through the tunnels, sewers, and forgotten spaces beneath America's frozen cities. Tomorrow I was going to disappear beneath Minneapolis and try to walk to safety through tunnels that most people did not even know existed. The question was not whether I would survive the journey. The question was whether there would be anything left to walk toward when I got there. The Ice Age had begun, and I was already running out of time. But down in those tunnels, with my maps and my 20 years of underground experience, I had something that nobody else had. I had a way out of the frozen wasteland that the surface world had become. Whether that way out led to safety or just to a different kind of death, I was about to find out. October 18th, 2024. Temperature -30, 7 degrees. That was the day I stopped being a surface dweller and became something else entirely. I woke up before dawn in my frozen apartment, knowing that this would be the last time I would see daylight for who knows how long. The decision to go underground was not really a decision anymore. It was the only option left for anyone who wanted to keep breathing. I had spent the previous evening laying out everything I owned on my apartment floor, sorting items into 3 categories: essential for survival, useful but not critical, and everything else that would have to stay behind forever. The essential pile was smaller than I had hoped and heavier than I could comfortably carry, which meant I had to make even harder choices about what truly mattered when your life depends on what fits in a backpack. My cave rescue gear went in first: headlamp with extra batteries, climbing harness, 50 feet of static rope, carabiners, pulleys, and my multi-tool that had gotten me out of more tight spots than I could count. Then came the survival basics: emergency food for 7 days, water purification tablets, basic first aid supplies, waterproof matches, emergency blanket, and a compact sleeping bag rated for temperatures well below freezing. The final essential items were my navigation tools: compass, measuring tape, pencil, and paper for updating my maps, and most importantly, the complete collection of tunnel schematics that I had spent 10 years creating. I took one last look at the photo of Sarah on my mantle. I had failed to save her when that building collapsed 3 years ago, but I was not going to fail myself. At least, that's what I told myself. Sarah had died because I was 30 seconds too late getting to the collapse site. 30 seconds that I had spent checking my equipment instead of just running toward the sound of people screaming for help. I had learned from that mistake, but the lesson was a hard one. Sometimes being prepared means being too slow, and sometimes being fast means being unprepared. The trick is knowing which situation you are in before it is too late to change your approach. But standing there looking at Sarah's picture, I realized something that I had never admitted to myself before. She had not died because I was 30 seconds too late. She had died because the building she was in had been constructed with substandard materials and inadequate structural reinforcement. She had died because city inspectors had signed off on construction permits without properly reviewing the architectural plans. She had died because a system that was supposed to protect people had failed, and individual heroism could not compensate for systemic failures. The ice age that was killing Minneapolis was just a bigger version of the same problem. And going underground was not heroism. It was just refusing to die because other people had not prepared for predictable disasters. I sealed my apartment, knowing I would never see it again, and made my way down to the basement of my building. The building superintendent had been gone for 2 days, but I still had the master key that he had given me years earlier, when I had helped him map the building's connection to the city steam system. That connection was going to be my entry point into the underground world, and if I was lucky, it would also be my exit from the frozen wasteland that Minneapolis had become. The building's basement was already below freezing, but it was still warmer than the surface. More importantly, it was familiar territory. I had spent hours down there over the years, tracing pipe runs and documenting connections to city infrastructure. I knew exactly where the old steam tunnel access was located, behind a false wall that had been installed in the 1960s when the building was converted from industrial use to residential apartments. Getting through that wall required tools that I had brought with me, and 20 minutes of careful work that would have been impossible if I was being rushed by desperate neighbors or curious onlookers. The tunnels were warmer than the surface, but that did not make them safe. 20 years of cave work had taught me that underground warmth usually means danger. Steam tunnels stay warm because they carry pressurized vapor that can scald you to death if a pipe bursts. Utility corridors stay warm because they house electrical systems that can electrocute you if water gets into the wrong places. Sewer systems stay warm because they carry biological waste that can make you sick in ways that will kill you slowly and unpleasantly. Warmth underground is not comfort. It is a warning that you are sharing space with systems that were not designed for human habitation. My first steps into the steam distribution tunnel that ran beneath 4th Street were tentative and methodical. I tested each foothold before putting my full weight on it, and I examined every surface with my headlamp before moving forward. The tunnel was brick-lined and about 6 feet high, which meant I could walk upright but had to be careful not to hit my head on the numerous pipe runs that crossed the ceiling. The floor was covered with a thin layer of condensation that made footing slippery, and the air was humid and warm in a way that felt tropical after 3 days of sub-zero temperatures. But the most important thing I noticed about that first tunnel was the evidence of other people: footprints in the condensation, candy bar wrappers, an empty water bottle, and most significantly, a makeshift sleeping area constructed from cardboard and old newspapers. Someone else had the same idea I did, and they had been living down there for at least a day or two. The question was whether they were still around, and if they were, whether they would see me as a fellow survivor or as competition for limited resources. I started keeping count of the bodies I found, not out of morbid curiosity, but because each mistake they made was a lesson that might keep me alive. The first body was in a connecting tunnel about 200 yards from my entry point. Middle-aged man, probably in his 50s, wearing clothes that were completely inappropriate for underground conditions. He was wearing a business suit and dress shoes, which told me that he had made the decision to go underground impulsively, without preparation or proper equipment. He had died from hypothermia, probably within the first 12 hours because he had not understood that underground temperatures in unheated sections could be just as deadly as surface temperatures if you were not properly dressed. The second body taught me a different lesson. Young woman, probably college age, wearing appropriate outdoor clothing but carrying no supplies. She had made it much further into the tunnel system than the businessman, but she had died from dehydration after getting lost in a section of connecting passages that formed a loop. I could see from the scuff marks on the walls that she had been walking in circles for hours trying to find her way back to a familiar tunnel. She had been carrying a cell phone, but cell phone GPS does not work underground, and cell phone flashlights do not last long enough to navigate complex tunnel systems. She had the right idea about going underground, but she had not prepared for the specific challenges of underground navigation. The third body was the most instructive of all. Older man, probably in his 60s, with proper clothing, adequate supplies, and a basic understanding of underground safety. He had died from carbon monoxide poisoning in a section of tunnel where a steam pipe had developed a small leak. The leak was not big enough to cause immediate danger from scalding, but it was big enough to displace oxygen in the tunnel air. He had set up camp in what looked like a safe location, but he had not understood that underground air quality can change rapidly and without warning. His death taught me that even experienced outdoorsmen could be killed by hazards that they were not trained to recognize. Every body I found told a story about what not to do, and I was starting to understand that most people who had tried to survive in the tunnels were making the same fundamental mistake. They were thinking about the underground as a shelter from the cold, but they were not thinking about it as a complex system with its own dangers and requirements. Steam tunnels, utility corridors, and drainage systems were not designed for human habitation. They were designed for maintenance access, which meant that staying alive in them required understanding how they worked and what could go wrong. After Bonby, 4 hours of careful navigation, I encountered my first living people. I heard voices before I saw them, echoing through the tunnels in a way that made it impossible to determine exactly where they were coming from. I stopped moving and listened carefully, trying to identify how many people were talking and whether their conversation sounded friendly or hostile. What I heard made me very nervous. 3 or 4 voices, all young, discussing someone they had seen earlier who had been carrying a large backpack and proper equipment. They were talking about me, and they were not talking about offering to help. I could see it in their eyes when I finally encountered them, that look people get when they realize civilization was just a thin coat of paint over desperation. I had seen it before in mine collapses, right before people started making fatal decisions. It is the look of someone who has suddenly understood that all the rules they thought were permanent were actually just temporary agreements, and those agreements were no longer in effect. These were college students, probably from the University of Minnesota, and they had been living in the tunnels for 2 days without adequate supplies or proper planning. There were 4 of them, 3 men and 1 woman, all probably in their early 20s. They had set up a camp in a wider section of tunnel where several passageways intersected, and they had been surviving on vending machine snacks and bottled water that they had looted from campus buildings before the surface became completely uninhabitable. But their supplies were running low, and they were starting to understand that their situation was not temporary. They were not going to be rescued. They were not going back to their dorm rooms. They were not going to finish the semester. They were going to live or die based on decisions they made in the next few days. The conversation started friendly enough, They asked where I had come from and where I was going. They wanted to know about conditions on the surface and whether I had seen any signs of organized rescue efforts. But as I answered their questions, I could see them evaluating me in a way that made my skin crawl. They were looking at my equipment, my supplies, my maps, and they were doing the same calculations that I had been doing about resource allocation and survival probability. The difference was that their calculations included taking my stuff and leaving me with nothing. I had been in enough dangerous situations to recognize the moment when talking stops and action starts. It happens when people run out of options and start thinking that violence might solve their problems. With these 4 students, that moment came when I mentioned that I had detailed maps of the tunnel system. Maps meant navigation capability, and navigation capability meant the difference between getting out alive and dying, lost in a maze of underground passages. They needed my maps more than they needed me, and I could see them reaching that conclusion in real time. The woman, who seemed to be the leader of their group, asked if I would be willing to share my maps with them. When I explained that the maps were hand-drawn originals that could not be easily copied, and that using them required experience interpreting underground navigation markers, her expression changed. She looked at the 3 men with her, and I saw them nod slightly in response to her unspoken question. They were going to try to take my maps by force, and they were probably going to try to take everything else I had while they were at it. I had 2 advantages that they did not know about. First, I had 20 years of experience working in confined spaces, which meant I knew how to move efficiently through tunnels that were too narrow for multiple people to navigate at the same time. Second, I had professional cave rescue training, which included techniques for escaping from dangerous situations in underground environments. When I saw them positioning themselves to surround me, I made a tactical decision that probably saved my life. Instead of trying to fight 4 people in an open area where they could use their numerical advantage, I moved quickly toward a narrow connecting passage that I had identified earlier as a potential escape route. The passage was only about 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, which meant that anyone following me would have to crawl single file and would not be able to coordinate their movements. More importantly, the passage led to a section of the tunnel system that I had mapped but they had not explored, which gave me a significant navigation advantage in unfamiliar territory. Running through those tunnels, I realized something that chilled me more than the cold above my maps only covered the parts of the system I had explored. The parts I had not mapped might be the very passages I needed to survive. I was navigating by memory through sections of tunnel that I had surveyed years earlier, but memory is unreliable under stress, and tunnel systems change over time as city workers modify connections and seal off passages. I was betting my life on information that might be outdated, and if I made a wrong turn, I could end up trapped in a dead end with 4 desperate people trying to kill me for my supplies. The chase lasted about 20 minutes, but it felt much longer. I could hear them behind me, struggling to navigate passages that I was moving through efficiently because of my professional training and my familiarity with the tunnel layout. But I could also hear them getting frustrated and angry, which meant that if they caught up with me, they were going to be more violent than they had originally planned. Running away from a threat sometimes makes the threat more dangerous, but staying to fight 4 people with nothing but a multi-tool and a 50-foot rope was not a realistic option. I finally lost them in a section of connecting tunnels that formed a complex 3-dimensional maze around the foundation of a large, downtown building. This was an area I had mapped extensively because of its architectural interest, and I knew it well enough to navigate quickly, even in limited light. More importantly, I knew that several of the passages in this section were dead ends that looked like they continued but actually terminated in solid concrete walls. If my pursuers chose the wrong route, they would waste time backtracking, and by the time they found the correct passage, I would be long gone. When I was sure I had lost them, I stopped to assess my situation. I was deeper in the tunnel system than I had planned to be on my first day underground, and I was in a section that connected to passages I had not fully explored. My supplies were intact, my maps were still with me, and I had not been injured in the escape. But I had also learned something important about the underground environment that I had not fully considered during my planning phase. The tunnels were not empty. They were filling up with desperate people, and desperate people were the most dangerous obstacle I was going to face. I spent my first night underground in a maintenance chamber that provided good concealment and multiple escape routes. The chamber was part of the building's original steam heating system, and it was warm enough to be comfortable but not so warm as to indicate dangerous pressure levels in the nearby pipes. I set up my sleeping area carefully, positioning myself so that I could hear anyone approaching from any direction, and I kept my essential supplies packed and ready to move quickly if I needed to leave in a hurry. Lying there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the city dying above me, I started to understand that my carefully planned route south was going to be much more complicated than I had anticipated. The tunnels were not just a transportation system anymore. They were becoming a refugee camp, a hiding place, and a hunting ground all at the same time. Every passage I traveled through might contain other survivors, and every encounter with other survivors was a potential conflict over limited resources in a world where the normal rules of social behavior were no longer in effect. But the most disturbing realization I had that first night was about my own psychology. When those 4 students had threatened me, my first instinct had not been to help them or to find a way to share resources. My first instinct had been to escape and to protect my own supplies, even if that meant leaving them to die in tunnels they did not know how to navigate. I had become part of the problem I was worried about. I was thinking about other people as threats to my survival rather than as fellow human beings who deserved help. The Ice Age was not just freezing the surface world, it was freezing something inside the people who were trying to survive it. That first night, listening to echoes of other survivors moving through distant tunnels, I understood that this was not just about getting from point A to point B. The tunnels were not empty, they were filling up with desperate people, and desperate people were the most dangerous obstacle I was going to face. Some of them, like the college students, were going to see me as a resource to be exploited. Others were going to see me as competition to be eliminated. A few might see me as a potential ally, but figuring out which category someone fell into was going to be a life or death decision that I would have to make quickly and accurately. I was 4 days into the Ice Age apocalypse, and I was already starting to understand that individual survival was going to require constant vigilance, careful resource management, and the ability to make hard choices about who to help and who to avoid. The underground was supposed to be my sanctuary from the frozen world above, but it was becoming clear that it had dangers of its own, and those dangers were multiplying as more desperate people found their way into the tunnel systems. Tomorrow, I was going to have to continue moving south through passages that might be occupied by hostile survivors, and I was going to have to do it while conserving supplies that were already running lower than I had planned. Worse, I was going to have to do it while knowing that every person I encountered might be the last person I ever met. The surface world had frozen solid, but the underground world was heating up with tensions that could explode into violence at any moment. I had survived my first day underground, but I was starting to realize that survival was not just about staying alive. It was about staying human, while doing whatever was necessary to keep breathing. And in a world where resources were scarce and help was not coming, staying human was going to be the hardest part of all. Day 4, underground. I had been staring at that collapsed tunnel for 3 hours, and I had come to a decision that went against every survival instinct I had developed over 20 years of rescue work. The main route I had planned to take south was completely blocked by what looked like a recent structural failure. Concrete slabs, twisted steel reinforcement, and broken pipework had created a barrier that would take heavy equipment days to clear. But heavy equipment was not coming, and I did not have days to wait for a rescue that was never going to happen. I was about to break the first rule of cave exploration: never go anywhere you have not mapped first. But then again, the whole world had just broken the rules, so maybe it was time I did too. Standing there looking at tons of rubble that had completely sealed off my planned route, I realized that all my careful preparation had been based on the assumption that the infrastructure I was navigating through would remain stable. That assumption had been wrong, and now I had to choose between turning back toward the college students who wanted to kill me for my supplies, or moving forward into unmapped territory that might lead anywhere or nowhere. The collapsed section appeared to be the result of freeze-thaw damage to the building foundation above the tunnel. When water freezes, it expands, and when building foundations are not properly insulated against extreme temperature fluctuations, The expansion can cause structural failures that cascade through connected systems. What had happened here was predictable if you understood the engineering principles involved, but it was also unavoidable once the temperature had dropped 40 degrees in 3 days. The entire underground infrastructure of Minneapolis was probably failing in similar ways throughout the city, which meant that even my most detailed maps were becoming obsolete in real time. I spent 2 hours examining alternative routes using my incomplete maps and trying to calculate the risks of each option. There were 3 possibilities. I could backtrack to a junction I had passed 6 hours earlier and try a completely different route that would add at least 2 days to my journey. I could attempt to climb over the collapse, which would be dangerous and might destabilize the rubble pile further. Or I could follow a utility corridor that my maps showed connecting to this area, but which I had never fully explored, because it required crawling through spaces that were barely large enough for a human body. The utility corridor was the most direct route, but it was also the most uncertain. My maps showed it running parallel to the main tunnel for about half a mile, before connecting to a larger passage that led toward the airport. But the maps also showed several places where the corridor was interrupted by electrical equipment, water pipes, or structural supports that might make passage impossible. If I got stuck halfway through, I would not be able to turn around, and I would die trapped in a space too small to allow rescue even if rescue were available. Following those utility lines, I started to understand something important. The city was not completely dead. Parts of it were still breathing, deep underground where the cold could not reach. Steam pipes were still carrying heat from the central power plant, which meant that somebody was still operating the boilers that kept the downtown core from freezing solid. Electrical cables were still carrying power to emergency systems, which meant that the grid had not completely collapsed. Sewer lines were still flowing, which meant that water treatment facilities were still partially operational. The surface world had become uninhabitable, but the underground systems that supported the surface world were still functioning, at least partially. This realization changed my understanding of what I was doing. I was not just fleeing through abandoned tunnels. I was traveling through the circulatory system of a city that was still alive but barely conscious. The infrastructure that had been designed to support 2 million people was now supporting maybe a few thousand survivors scattered throughout the underground network. That infrastructure was overbuilt for its current load, which meant it might continue functioning longer than anyone expected. But it also meant that anyone who understood how to access that infrastructure would have significant advantages over people who were just hiding in random tunnels, hoping for rescue. The utility corridor turned out to be exactly as challenging as I had expected and worse than I had feared. The first 100 yards required crawling on my hands and knees through a space that was about 3 feet high and 4 feet wide. The walls were lined with pipes, cables, and junction boxes that left very little room for a human body, and the floor was covered with a layer of condensation that made every surface slippery. Moving my backpack through this space was like trying to thread a needle while wearing mittens, and I quickly realized that I was going to have to push my pack ahead of me and hope that I did not encounter any obstacles that would prevent me from retrieving it. But the real challenge was not the physical difficulty of crawling through the corridor. The real challenge was the psychological pressure of being in a space where I could not turn around, could not sit up, and could not move quickly if I encountered a problem. This was the kind of environment where panic kills people, because panic makes you move faster and less carefully, and moving faster in a confined space usually means getting stuck more thoroughly. I had to maintain absolute mental discipline and move with deliberate precision, even though every instinct was telling me to hurry toward whatever exit might exist at the far end of this mechanical nightmare. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, the corridor opened into a larger space that my maps identified as a utility junction for the building above. This was a maintenance area that housed electrical panels, water meters, and access points for various building systems. More importantly, it was warm, dry, and large enough for me to stand up and reorganize my equipment. I took inventory of my supplies, checked my maps, and tried to determine exactly where I was in relation to my planned route. That was when I heard the voices. Quiet conversation coming from somewhere deeper in the utility area, too indistinct to make out words, but clearly human. My first instinct was to avoid contact entirely, but I was in a dead-end space with only one exit, and that exit led back through the corridor I had just crawled through. If whoever was talking decided to investigate the utility junction, I would be trapped with no way to escape and no room to maneuver. I had to make contact and determine whether these people were a threat, and I had to do it before they discovered me and assumed that I was the threat. I approached the voices carefully, using my headlamp on its lowest setting to avoid being seen before I could assess the situation. What I found was not what I had expected. A woman in her 30s and 2 children, a girl who looked about 8 years old and a boy who appeared to be maybe 6. They had been living in this utility space for 3 days, and they were in bad shape. The woman, who told me her name was Janet, explained that they had fled their apartment when the power failed and had been trying to reach her sister's house in the suburbs when they got lost in the tunnel system. Janet's husband had been with them initially, but he had gone back to their apartment on the second day to get more supplies and had never returned. Janet assumed he was dead, either from the cold or from other survivors who were taking supplies by force. She had been rationing their food carefully, but they were down to their last meal, and the children were showing signs of malnutrition and dehydration. Worse, both children were exhibiting symptoms that I recognized from my rescue work as early-stage carbon monoxide poisoning. The utility room they had chosen for shelter was heated by a gas-powered system that was not properly ventilated for continuous human occupancy. The heating system was keeping them warm, but it was also slowly filling the air with carbon monoxide at levels that were not immediately dangerous, but would cause serious health problems if they stayed there much longer. The children were complaining of headaches and nausea, and they were both more lethargic than healthy children should be even under stressful circumstances. Looking at those kids, I saw Sarah's face the day she died. I had been 30 seconds too late getting to her building collapse. 30 seconds that haunted me for 3 years. I was not going to be 30 seconds too late again. But I also knew that taking responsibility for 3 additional people would change everything about my survival calculations. My food supplies were planned for one person making a week-long journey. My water purification capacity was designed for individual use. My shelter was a one-person sleeping bag. My escape routes were planned for someone traveling alone who could move quickly through narrow spaces. I did the math 3 times, hoping I would get a different answer. 4 people, my remaining supplies, unknown distance to safety. The numbers did not work. But sometimes the right choice is not the one that works on paper. I had spent 3 years living with the guilt of being too late to save Sarah, and I was not going to spend the rest of my life, however long that might be, living with the guilt of walking away from 2 children who would die without help. The practical part of my brain was screaming that this was a mistake that would get all of us killed. The human part of my brain was telling the practical part to shut up and figure out how to make it work. The immediate problem was getting Janet and the children out of the contaminated utility room without making their carbon monoxide poisoning worse. Moving them meant exposing them to physical exertion that would increase their oxygen demand while their blood was already carrying reduced oxygen due to carbon monoxide exposure. But leaving them in the utility room meant continued exposure to gas that would eventually kill them. I had to choose between a risk that might kill them and a certainty that would kill them, which was not really a choice at all. Michael, the 6-year-old boy, was in worse condition than his sister Emma. He was confused, lethargic, and complaining of severe headaches. His lips had a slightly bluish tint that indicated inadequate oxygen in his blood, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. I had seen carbon monoxide poisoning before in miners trapped in poorly ventilated spaces. Michael had maybe hours before permanent damage, maybe less, and Emma was not far behind. If I was going to save them, I had to get them out of that utility room immediately and find a way to get them medical attention that probably did not exist anywhere in the city. Janet was panicked, desperate, and not thinking clearly, which was understandable but also dangerous. Panic spreads quickly in survival situations, and if she lost control, she could get all of us killed through poor decision-making. I had to establish myself as the leader of this group immediately, not because I wanted authority, but because someone had to make life and death decisions quickly and accurately. In rescue situations, the person with the most relevant experience takes charge, and everyone else follows orders without argument. That system works because it keeps people alive when there is no time for committee meetings or democratic decision-making. I explained to Janet that we had to leave immediately, that the children were being poisoned by the heating system, and that staying in the utility room would kill them within hours. I also explained that the journey to safety was going to be difficult and dangerous, and that all of us would have to follow my instructions exactly without question or delay. She agreed, but I could see in her eyes that she did not fully understand what she was agreeing to. She was thinking about getting her children to safety, but she was not thinking about what would happen if we encountered hostile survivors, structural collapses, or any of the dozen other ways that people die in underground environments. Carrying Michael through those tunnels, feeling how light he was, how shallow his breathing had become, I realized that saving people is not about having a plan. It is about adapting when every plan fails. My original route was blocked by structural collapse. My backup route was too narrow for a family group. My supply calculations were based on supporting one person, not four. My timeline was based on moving quickly through familiar territory, not slowly through unmapped areas while carrying a sick child. Everything I had prepared for was wrong, and I was making life and death decisions based on incomplete information and rapidly changing circumstances. But I also realized something else that changed my entire perspective on what I was doing. Janet and her children were not just additional people who needed my help. They were also additional resources, additional capabilities, and additional motivation to succeed. Janet knew parts of the city that I did not know well. Emma was small enough to fit through spaces that adults could not navigate. Michael, despite his current condition, had child-level observation skills that sometimes notice things that adults miss. More importantly, having other people depending on me meant that giving up was not an option. When you are traveling alone, you can make the decision to stop fighting and accept death. When you are responsible for other people, especially children, that decision is not available. The route I chose led us through maintenance corridors that I had mapped incompletely, following utility lines that I hoped would take us toward the airport district, where I thought we might find medical supplies and other survivors who could help with the children. But as we moved through the tunnel system, I started to notice things that my maps had not documented. Connections between different utility networks that created alternate routes. Access points to building basements that were not marked on any city plans. Signs of recent modification to tunnel structures that indicated ongoing maintenance work. The tunnels were telling a story, and it was not a story about individual survival anymore. It was about groups forming, territories being claimed, resources being fought over. The apocalypse was not just above ground, it was down here too, and it was getting organized. I found evidence of camps that had been established and then abandoned. Supply caches that had been hidden by one group and raided by another. Territorial markers that indicated different areas were controlled by different survivor groups. The underground was becoming a complex social and political environment, and anyone who wanted to survive was going to have to understand and navigate that environment successfully. But the most significant discovery I made while carrying Michael through those tunnels was about the scope of the underground infrastructure itself. The system was much more extensive and much more interconnected than my maps had indicated. There were passages connecting distant parts of the city that I had never known existed. There were alternate routes to every major destination that provided options when primary routes were blocked. There were access points to critical infrastructure that could provide heat, power, and clean water if you knew how to use them safely. Standing at a major junction where multiple tunnel systems intersected, I realized that my maps were not just incomplete. They were fundamentally wrong about the scale and complexity of what existed beneath Minneapolis. I had been thinking about the underground as a transportation network, but it was actually a complete alternate city with its own neighborhoods, resources, and social dynamics. The people who were going to survive this disaster were not the ones who hid in random tunnels waiting for rescue. They were the ones who learned to live and work in the underground city, and who contributed to the communities that were forming in the spaces beneath the frozen surface world. With Michael's condition becoming critical and no clear route to immediate medical help, I had to make another decision that went against my training and experience. Instead of continuing toward my planned destination, I was going to have to Trust that the underground community I was starting to understand would have resources and people who could help us. I was going to have to stop thinking about this as a solo survival journey and start thinking about it as joining a society that was rebuilding itself in the most unlikely of places. The choice I made next would determine whether Michael lived or died, whether Janet and Emma survived their first week underground, and whether I would spend the rest of this disaster alone or as part of something larger than individual survival. I chose to follow signs that indicated other survivor groups were active in the area, and to trust that people who were organizing communities underground were people who might be willing to help a family in crisis. It was a gamble based on hope, rather than knowledge, but sometimes hope is the only navigation tool you have left. I chose the tunnel heading toward the airport. Not because I had any solid reasoning, but because airports have medical facilities, backup power, and people trained to handle emergencies. What I did not know was that I was about to discover just how wrong you can be and still get lucky. Michael was getting heavier in my arms, even though he was getting lighter from dehydration and malnutrition. That is what carbon monoxide poisoning does to children. It makes them seem sleepy and peaceful, while it slowly steals the oxygen from their blood and kills their brain cells one by one. The route toward the airport district led us through increasingly complex passages that my maps showed only in rough outline. I had surveyed this area years earlier, but not thoroughly, because it was primarily industrial infrastructure that did not connect directly to the residential and commercial tunnels I had been more interested in exploring. Now I was regretting that decision, because the passages we were navigating were more challenging than anything I had encountered so far, and I was trying to move through them while carrying a sick child and guiding two other people who had no underground experience. Wading through knee-deep freezing water, I started to understand why my cave rescue training had emphasized hypothermia prevention. The cold was not just above ground anymore, it was following us down. The water in the tunnel was runoff from burst pipes in the buildings above us, and it was barely above freezing temperature. Every step we took through that water was pulling heat out of our bodies and increasing our risk of hypothermia, especially for the children who had less body mass and fewer calories to burn for warmth. Janet was trying to carry Emma, but she was not strong enough to keep her daughter out of the water completely, which meant that Emma's feet and legs were getting soaked with ice-cold water that would quickly lead to frostbite if we did not find warm shelter soon. The tunnel system in this area had been damaged by the same freeze-thaw cycles that had collapsed my original route, but the damage here was different and in some ways more dangerous. Instead of complete blockages, we were encountering partial structural failures that made passages unstable and unpredictable. Ceiling sections that looked solid but were actually hanging by damaged supports that could collapse if disturbed. Floor sections that had cracked and shifted, creating gaps that could trap a foot or ankle if you stepped wrong. Wall sections where the mortar had failed, allowing individual bricks to fall without warning. Every detour cost us time we did not have and supplies we could not spare. But more than that, each blocked passage meant my maps were becoming useless. I was navigating by instinct now, and instinct is not always right. I had to make navigation decisions based on limited information, incomplete maps, and the hope that passages that looked promising would actually lead where I thought they were leading. In cave rescue work, this kind of navigation is called expedition mode, and it is the most dangerous way to explore underground systems because you are always operating beyond your confirmed knowledge. Michael's condition became critical about 2 hours into our journey toward the airport. He lost consciousness while I was carrying him, and his breathing became irregular and shallow. Janet started crying and asking me if he was going to die, which was exactly the kind of question I could not answer honestly without causing her to panic completely. I had seen enough mining accidents to know what Michael's symptoms meant. His brain was not getting enough oxygen and every minute counted, but the direct route to the airport meant going through passages I had marked as structurally unstable, and taking that risk with 4 people, including 2 children, was a decision that could get all of us killed. The dangerous shortcut I was considering involved traveling through a section of tunnel that ran directly beneath a large office building that had been constructed in the 1970s, with building techniques that were not designed for extreme temperature fluctuations. The building's foundation was showing signs of freeze damage, and the tunnel beneath it was experiencing structural stress that could lead to catastrophic failure. But that tunnel was also the most direct route to the airport district, and it would save us at least 3 hours of travel time that Michael probably did not have. I made the decision to risk the unstable tunnel sections, knowing that it was probably the wrong choice, but also knowing that all of our other options were definitely wrong choices. Sometimes in rescue work, you have to choose between different ways of possibly dying rather than choosing between life and death. The key is to choose the option that gives you the best chance of success, even if that chance is still very small. Carrying Michael through passages that could collapse at any moment was dangerous, but watching him die slowly from carbon monoxide poisoning while taking a safer route was not really an option. The unstable tunnel section was worse than I had anticipated based on my visual inspection. The structural damage was not just cosmetic cracking. It was fundamental failure of the support systems that kept tons of building foundation from collapsing into the tunnel space. As we moved through this area, I could hear the building above us settling and shifting in response to the temperature changes, and each shift put additional stress on tunnel supports that were already failing. We were walking through a space that could become our tomb with very little warning. Lying there with concrete pressing down on my chest, listening to Michael's labored breathing echo off the tunnel walls, I realized that being a rescuer and being rescued require completely different kinds of courage. When you are rescuing someone else, your training and experience give you confidence and help you make good decisions under pressure. When you are the one who needs rescue, you have to trust other people to make those decisions for you, and trust is much harder than knowledge. I had gotten pinned under a section of ceiling that had partially collapsed, and I could not free myself without help from Janet, who had never been in an emergency situation like this before. Janet managed to move enough debris to free my legs, but the effort cost us 20 minutes and used up energy reserves that she could not afford to lose. More importantly, the noise we made during the rescue attracted attention from other people who were traveling through nearby tunnels. I could hear voices in the distance, and they were moving in our direction. This could be other survivors who might help us, or it could be people like the college students who would see us as a resource to be exploited. Either way, we could not stay in the unstable tunnel section to find out, because the partial collapse had made the entire area even more dangerous than it had been before. We reached the edge of the airport district just as I was starting to think that we were not going to make it. Michael had been unconscious for over an hour. His breathing was getting weaker, and both Janet and Emma were showing signs of exhaustion that meant they could not continue much longer without rest and food. I was carrying Michael and most of our supplies. Janet was helping Emma walk, and all of us were moving much more slowly than we needed to be moving. We were in a race against time, and we were losing. That was when we encountered Frank, an airport maintenance worker who had been living in the tunnel system since the power grid failed 5 days earlier. Frank looked at me like I was insane for bringing a family through the tunnels, but when he saw Michael's condition, something changed. In his expression, he understood that sometimes insane is the only option left. Frank had been maintaining the airport's underground systems for 15 years, and he knew parts of the tunnel network that were not on any of my maps. More importantly, he knew where to find other airport workers who had established a survivor community in the airport's underground maintenance facilities. Frank led us through passages that I had never seen before, even though they were located in areas that I thought I had mapped completely. The airport's underground infrastructure was much more extensive than I had realized, with connections to city utilities, private maintenance tunnels, and emergency systems that were designed to keep the airport operational during disasters. What I had not understood was that airport infrastructure is built to higher standards than most city systems, because airports cannot afford to have critical failures that would ground flights and cost millions of dollars in lost revenue. The airport survivor community that Frank brought us to was unlike anything I had expected to find. 12 airport workers and their families had been living in a maintenance facility that had backup power, emergency medical supplies, and access to clean water and food storage areas. They had been there for a week, and they had organized themselves into a functional community with work assignments, resource allocation, and security procedures. Most importantly for Michael's situation, one of the survivors was a paramedic who had been working airport emergency services when the disaster started. Watching the airport medic work on Michael, I realized that survival was not just about making it through the disaster, it was about what you brought to the community when you got there. The medic had training and experience that I did not have, but I had tunnel maps and underground navigation skills that none of them possessed. Frank had mechanical knowledge and access to airport systems, but he did not know how those systems connected to the larger city infrastructure. Each person in the community had capabilities that were valuable to the group, and the group's survival depended on everyone contributing their skills and knowledge. The medical treatment for Michael involved getting him into an environment with clean air and giving him oxygen from emergency supplies that the airport kept for medical emergencies. The treatment was simple in concept, but required equipment and knowledge that would not have been available anywhere else in the city. Within 2 hours, Michael's color was improving, his breathing was becoming more regular, and he was starting to respond to voices and touch. He was not out of danger completely, but he was stable enough that his long-term recovery looked possible if we could keep him in a safe environment. Janet's relief was overwhelming, but it was also complicated by the realization that staying with the airport community meant depending on other people for survival, and independence had been her primary goal since her husband had died. She was grateful for the help, but she was also worried about what would be expected of her in return and whether she and her children would be welcome in a community that was already struggling to support its existing members. These were practical concerns that went to the heart of how survivor communities function, and they were questions that I was starting to think about for myself as well. The airport group had been surviving for a week, but they had been thinking small, just keeping themselves alive. My tunnel maps changed that conversation. Suddenly, we were not just survivors anymore. We were potential rescuers. The maps I had, spent 10 years creating, showed connections between the airport and other parts of the city that the airport workers had not known existed. More importantly, the maps showed routes that could be used to reach other survivor groups and potentially coordinate rescue operations on a much larger scale than anyone had been considering. Frank and the other airport workers were fascinated by the scope and detail of my tunnel documentation. They had been thinking about the underground primarily as a place to hide until rescue services were restored, but my maps showed them that the underground could be a complete alternate infrastructure for supporting human life. Steam tunnels could provide heat, utility corridors could provide access to power and communications, and maintenance areas could provide shelter and storage for supplies. The underground was not just a temporary refuge. It could be a permanent alternative to surface living, if surface conditions remained uninhabitable. But the most significant discovery I made during my first day with the airport community was about the scope of survivor organization throughout the city. The airport group had been in radio contact with other survivor communities in different parts of Minneapolis, and they were starting to coordinate resource sharing and mutual assistance. There were groups in the University District, the downtown core, the industrial areas, and the residential neighborhoods. Some groups were large and well-organized, others were small and struggling, but all of them were learning to work together in ways that were creating a new kind of society. The radio communications revealed something that changed my understanding of what we were dealing with. This was not a temporary disaster that would be resolved by outside rescue efforts. This was a permanent change in living conditions that required permanent adaptations in how human communities function. The surface world was not coming back, at least not in any form that would support the population levels and lifestyle expectations that had existed before the temperature drop. The underground communities were not waiting for rescue. They were building the foundation of whatever civilization was going to replace the one that had frozen to death. 3 days after Michael's treatment began, I received a radio message that forced me to make the hardest decision I had faced since the disaster started. The message was from Jake, my former partner from the Cave Rescue Service, and it was coming from somewhere in the downtown tunnel network. Jake was alive, and he was with a group of over 60 survivors who had been trapped in the city center for 5 days. They had food and shelter, but they were running out of clean water, and several people in their group were injured and needed medical attention that they could not provide. Jake's message was specifically directed to me because someone in his group had heard my voice on the radio network and recognized it. Jake knew that if anyone could navigate the downtown tunnel system safely, it would be someone with my experience and maps. but he also knew that any rescue attempt would be dangerous and might not succeed. The downtown area had been hit hard by structural failures, and the tunnels were filled with debris, floodwater, and other hazards that made navigation extremely difficult. More importantly, there were reports of hostile survivor groups in that area who were taking supplies by force and not allowing people to pass through their territory safely. The hardest part of being a rescuer is not the danger, it is deciding who gets saved first. Michael was stable but still needed medical supervision. Janet and Emma were safe but still dependent on the airport community for food and shelter. The airport group was well organized but still needed my tunnel knowledge to expand their rescue operations. Jake and 60 other people were in immediate danger but located in an area that would require a complex and dangerous rescue operation that might not succeed and might get additional people killed in the attempt. I had to choose between staying with the family I had already saved and risking everything to help rescue dozens more people, including my former partner who had saved my life twice in previous mine collapse situations. I had to weigh the certainty of continued safety for the people I had already helped against the possibility of saving many more people who might die without assistance. I had to decide whether my responsibility was to the individuals I had made commitments to, or to the larger community of survivors who needed my skills and knowledge. Frank handed me the radio, and through the static I heard a voice I recognized, Jake's voice, calling for help from somewhere in the downtown tunnel maze. He was alive, somewhere in that complex network of passages beneath the city center, with over 60 survivors who were running out of time. They had been trapped for 5 days, and they were counting on someone with tunnel experience to guide them out. Michael was stable for now. Janet and Emma were safe, and I had delivered them to the best sanctuary I could find. But 60 people, including the man who had saved my life twice in mine collapses, were counting on someone to help them survive. I looked at my maps, then at the family I had carried to safety, then back at the radio. The hardest part of being a rescuer is not the danger, it is deciding who gets saved first. I could stay with the airport community and help them expand their operations gradually and safely, or I could attempt a rescue mission that would put multiple lives at risk for the chance of saving many more lives. I could honor my commitment to the people who were depending on me, or I could honor my obligation to people who needed help that only I could provide. The choice I made would define not just my own survival, but my understanding of what survival meant in a world where individual safety had to be balanced against community responsibility. I was no longer just trying to escape from a disaster. I was trying to help build whatever was going to replace the world that the disaster had destroyed. And that meant making decisions that were about more than just staying alive. It meant making decisions about what kind of person I was going to be in whatever world we were creating in the tunnels beneath the frozen ruins of Minneapolis. I made the hardest decision of my life that night. I was going back into the tunnels, not to escape this time, but to bring 60 people home. And I was not going alone. Frank volunteered immediately when I explained the situation, along with 2 other airport workers who had underground maintenance experience. We were not just attempting a rescue mission. We were testing whether the survivor communities that were forming beneath Minneapolis could work together to save lives on a scale that none of us had attempted before. Planning a rescue mission is like solving a puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the other half might kill you. But after 20 years of pulling people out of impossible situations, I knew something important. Impossible just means you have not figured out the right approach yet. The challenge we faced was different from anything I had handled before. Instead of rescuing 1 or 2 people from a confined space, we were trying to evacuate 63 individuals from a complex urban environment that was actively hostile to human survival. We needed multiple routes, backup plans, medical supplies, communication systems, and coordination between teams that had never worked together before. The airport community had resources that I had not expected: emergency medical equipment, portable communication devices, food supplies that could support additional people, and most importantly, organized leadership that could make decisions quickly and implement complex plans efficiently. Frank and his colleagues knew how to work as a team under pressure, and they understood that successful rescue operations require precise coordination and absolute discipline. They were not just volunteers helping with a dangerous mission. They were professionals who were treating this rescue as seriously as they had treated their jobs when the airport was still operational. We spent 6 hours planning the mission, using my tunnel maps to identify multiple routes between the airport and the downtown area where Jake's group was trapped. The direct route was blocked by structural damage and flooded sections, but there were alternate passages that could work if we moved carefully and accepted higher levels of risk. More importantly, we identified supply caches and safe stopping points along the route where we could rest, reorganize, and treat injured people if the evacuation took longer than expected. The route planning revealed something that changed my understanding of the underground infrastructure completely. The tunnel systems beneath Minneapolis were much more interconnected than my maps had shown, with connections between different networks that created alternate routes to almost every major destination in the city. What I had been thinking of as separate systems were actually components of a single integrated network that could support movement and communication across the entire metropolitan area. The underground was not just a collection of tunnels. It was a complete alternate transportation and communication infrastructure that could support organized human activity on a scale I had never imagined. Going back through those tunnels, I realized they were not the same passages I had traveled 4 days earlier. The freeze-thaw cycles were changing everything, creating new dangers and new opportunities. The underground was evolving, just like we were. Passages that had been stable when I first traveled through them were now showing signs of structural stress. Areas that had been dry were now flooded with runoff from burst pipes. Sections that had been empty were now occupied by survivor groups who were claiming territory and controlling access to resources. But the changes were not all negative. Some of the structural damage had opened new connections between tunnel systems, creating shortcuts that had not existed before. Some of the flooding had cleared debris from passages that had been partially blocked. Some of the survivor groups had established supply caches and communication relays that made long-distance travel safer and more predictable. The underground environment was becoming more complex, but it was also becoming more supportive of organized human activity. The navigation back to downtown Minneapolis took us through areas where I could see evidence of increasing organization among survivor groups, territorial markers that indicated which passages were controlled by which communities, supply distribution points where different groups were sharing resources, communication relay stations where messages were being passed between distant communities. The underground was not just a refuge from the frozen surface world. It was becoming a functioning society with its own economy, politics, and culture. Frank and the other airport workers were amazed by the scope of survivor organization that my tunnel maps revealed. They had been thinking about the underground primarily as a temporary shelter, but the evidence we were seeing indicated that permanent communities were forming with sophisticated systems for resource management, security, and mutual assistance. The airport community was not an isolated group of people waiting for rescue. It was one component of a larger network of communities that were rebuilding human civilization in the spaces beneath the frozen ruins of the surface world. The journey to Jake's location took 12 hours of careful navigation through some of the most complex tunnel systems I had ever encountered. We moved in single file, maintaining radio contact with the airport community and stopping every 2 hours to rest and check our position against my maps. The physical demands of underground travel were significant, especially for Frank and his colleagues who were not accustomed to crawling through narrow passages and climbing over debris obstacles. But their mechanical knowledge proved invaluable when we encountered damaged infrastructure that required repair or modification to allow safe passage. Finding Jake's group required navigation through the most complex section of tunnel network I had ever attempted. The downtown area was served by multiple overlapping infrastructure systems that had been built and modified over more than a century. Steam tunnels from the 1920s intersected with utility corridors from the 1950s, which connected to modern fiber optic cable runs and emergency communication systems. The result was a three-dimensional maze of passages that required constant reference to my maps and frequent backtracking when routes turned out to be blocked or modified. But the complexity of the downtown tunnel system also provided advantages that I had not anticipated. Multiple route options meant that if one passage was blocked, there were usually alternatives that could get us to the same destination. Redundant utility systems meant that even if primary services had failed, Backup systems were often still operational. Most importantly, the interconnected nature of the infrastructure meant that Jake's group had access to resources and communication capabilities that would not have been available in more isolated locations. The reunion with Jake and my other rescue service colleagues was emotional in ways that I had not expected. Seeing Jake again, seeing our old rescue team trying to keep 60 people alive with no equipment and no plan, I understood something I had been missing. Individual survival was just the beginning. Community survival was the real challenge. Jake and the others had been thinking about their situation as a temporary emergency that would be resolved by outside rescue efforts, but I could see immediately that they needed to start thinking about it as a permanent change that required permanent adaptations. Jake's group had been surviving in a maintenance facility beneath a large office building, using emergency supplies and improvised shelter to keep 63 people alive for 5 days. They had done an impressive job of organizing themselves and managing their resources, but they were facing problems that could not be solved without outside assistance. Their food supplies were running low, their medical capabilities were limited, and several people in the group were injured or sick in ways that required treatment they could not provide. More importantly, Jake's group was starting to experience internal tensions that could threaten their cohesion and effectiveness. Different people had different ideas about what they should do next, how resources should be allocated, and who should make decisions for the group. These were predictable problems that occur in any group of people who are forced to live together under stressful conditions for extended periods, but they were also problems that could get people killed if they were not managed properly. The assessment I made of Jake's group revealed both strengths and weaknesses that would affect any evacuation attempt. The strengths included experienced leadership, good organization, and strong group discipline. The weaknesses included limited mobility for injured and elderly members, inadequate equipment for underground travel, and unrealistic expectations about what rescue would involve. Moving 63 people through complex tunnel systems was going to require careful planning, multiple trips, and acceptance of risks that some group members were not prepared to accept. I had rescued individuals from caves, mines, collapsed buildings, but I had never tried to move an entire community through hostile territory. Every decision affected dozens of lives, and there was no room for error. The logistics were overwhelming when I tried to think about them all at once, so I broke the problem down into smaller components that could be solved individually. Route planning, equipment distribution, group organization, medical support, communication systems, and contingency planning for the dozen different ways that things could go wrong. The evacuation plan we developed involved moving people in smaller groups over multiple trips, using different routes to avoid overloading any single passage with too many people at the same time. Each group would include at least one person, with underground experience, basic medical supplies, communication equipment, and emergency food and water. The groups would travel at different times to reduce the risk of everyone being trapped together if we encountered problems, and each group would have alternate destinations if the primary route to the airport became unusable. But the most challenging aspect of the evacuation was not the logistics. It was the psychology of convincing 63 people to trust their lives to a plan that required them to travel through dangerous underground passages to reach a destination that most of them had never seen. Many of Jake's group members were afraid of confined spaces, had no underground experience, and were skeptical about whether the airport community could actually provide the safety and resources that we were promising. The conversation with Jake's group about the evacuation plan revealed fundamental differences in how different people were thinking about the disaster and what their options were. Some people were still expecting organized rescue efforts from government agencies or military units. Others were convinced that the surface world would eventually become habitable again, and that underground communities were just temporary measures. A few understood that permanent changes were necessary, but they disagreed about what those changes should look like and how they should be implemented. The first evacuation group consisted of 12 people, including the most seriously injured individuals and those with medical conditions that required immediate attention. This group traveled with Frank, who knew the route well by this point, and carried medical supplies that could stabilize critical patients during the journey. The trip took 8 hours due to the slow pace required by injured group members, but it was successful. And the arrival of these individuals at the airport community demonstrated that large-scale evacuation was possible. The second evacuation group was larger, consisting of 18 people including families with children and elderly individuals who needed assistance but were not critically injured. This group traveled with Jake, who used his emergency management experience to maintain group discipline and morale during the difficult journey. The route was modified slightly to avoid a section of tunnel that had shown signs of instability since the first group had passed through, demonstrating the importance of real-time route adjustment based on changing conditions. The third and fourth evacuation groups moved more quickly, consisting of able-bodied adults who could navigate the tunnel systems with minimal assistance. These groups served as supply carriers, bringing food, equipment, and other resources from Jake's downtown location to the airport community. They also served as communication links, carrying messages between the two communities and coordinating the timing of subsequent evacuation operations. Leading 63 people through those tunnels, I realized that my 20 years of rescue experience had been preparation for this moment. Not just the technical skills, but the ability to make life or death decisions for people who were counting on me to get it right. Every choice I made about route selection, timing, group composition, and risk management would determine whether specific individuals lived or died. The responsibility was overwhelming, but it was also clarifying. All the theoretical discussions about survival strategies and community organization came down to practical decisions that had to be made quickly and implemented effectively. The most dangerous part of the evacuation was a section of tunnel that ran beneath an area where multiple buildings had suffered structural damage from the freeze-thaw cycles. The passage was unstable, partially flooded, and filled with debris that made movement slow and difficult. But it was also the most direct route to the airport, and taking longer alternate routes would have meant additional exposure to hypothermia and exhaustion for group members who were already struggling with the physical demands of underground travel. I made the decision to use my professional cave rescue techniques to stabilize the most dangerous sections of the passage using rope work and debris management to create a safer corridor for the evacuees to travel through. This work was time-consuming and physically demanding, but it was also exactly the kind of problem-solving that my rescue training had prepared me for. I was not just guiding people through existing tunnels, I was modifying the tunnels to make them safer for people who did not have underground experience. The stabilization work required techniques that I had learned during mine rescue operations, where unstable passages had to be secured before rescue teams could safely extract trapped workers. I used timber supports salvaged from damaged sections of tunnel to reinforce ceiling areas that showed signs of imminent collapse. I installed rope handrails along sections where the floor was uneven or slippery, providing secure handholds for people who were not experienced with underground movement. Most importantly, I created bypass routes around the most dangerous obstacles, allowing evacuation groups to avoid hazards that could not be eliminated entirely. The successful arrival of Jake's group at the airport community was a moment of celebration, but it was also a moment of recognition that we had fundamentally changed both communities by bringing them together. The airport group had doubled in size overnight, which meant that all their resource allocation, work assignments, and decision-making processes had to be reorganized to accommodate new people with different skills, needs, and perspectives. Jake's group had to adapt to living in a community that had already established its own culture and procedures during their week of independent operation. But the most significant change was in my own understanding of what I was doing and why it mattered. Michael's recovery was progressing well, and Janet and Emma were becoming integrated members of the airport community. Jake and his rescue service colleagues were sharing their emergency management expertise with the airport workers. The combined community now had over 75 people with diverse skills and knowledge that made the group more capable and resilient than either community had been separately. The integration of the two survivor groups created opportunities that neither group had been able to pursue independently. The airport community had resources and infrastructure, but they had been limited by their small size and narrow range of expertise. Jake's group had leadership experience and diverse skills, but they had been limited by their lack of resources and secure facilities. Together, they formed a community that was large enough and capable enough to undertake projects that went far beyond basic survival. The first major project that the combined community decided to pursue was the establishment of communication and coordination networks with other survivor groups throughout the city. My tunnel maps provided the foundation for this project, but the implementation required expertise in electronics, logistics, and community organization that was only available because we now had a larger and more diverse group of people to work with. We were not just surviving anymore. We were building infrastructure that could support long-term community development. The radio networks that we established over the following weeks revealed the true scope of survivor organization throughout Minneapolis and the surrounding area. There were dozens of communities, ranging in size from small family groups to large, organized settlements, scattered throughout the underground infrastructure of the metropolitan area. Some communities were thriving, others were struggling, but all of them were learning to work together in ways that were creating something entirely new. The communication network allowed us to coordinate resource sharing between communities that had different strengths and needs. Communities with medical expertise could provide treatment for injured people from other areas. Communities with technical skills could maintain and repair infrastructure that served multiple groups. Communities with food production capabilities could supply nutrition for communities that specialized in other activities. The underground was becoming an integrated society rather than a collection of isolated survival groups. But perhaps the most important discovery we made through the communication network was about the scope of the disaster and the long-term prospects for surface recovery. Reports from communities throughout the region indicated that the temperature drop was not temporary and was not limited to Minnesota. Similar conditions were being reported across the entire northern United States, and communications with the outside world suggested that the climate change was permanent and global in scope. This information fundamentally changed how we thought about our situation and our future plans. We were not waiting for rescue from outside agencies that were dealing with their own survival crises. We were not preparing for eventual return to surface living conditions that were no longer viable for human habitation. We were building permanent alternative communities that would need to be self-sufficient and sustainable for the indefinite future. The first 96 hours taught me how to survive. The next week taught me why survival matters. It is not about outlasting the disaster. It is about building something better when the disaster ends. The underground communities were not waiting for the surface world to recover. They were creating an alternate society that could function independently of surface infrastructure and surface resources. They were proving that human civilization could adapt to environmental changes that had seemed impossible to survive. My name is Thaddeus Grimsby. I survived the first 96 hours of the Ice Age apocalypse by going underground. But what I learned in the days that followed changed everything I thought I knew about survival. It is not about making it through alone. It is about making sure nobody has to face the darkness by themselves. The world above might have frozen solid, but down here in the tunnels we are building something warm. And come spring, when the ice starts to melt, we will be ready to help rebuild whatever is left of the world above. Because that is what rescuers do. We bring people home. The tunnel maps that I had created as a hobby became the foundation for connecting survivor communities across the region. The rescue techniques that I had learned for individual emergencies became the basis for coordinating community-scale evacuation and relief operations. The underground infrastructure that had been designed to support surface civilization became the foundation for a new kind of civilization that could function independently of surface conditions. We were not just surviving the Ice Age. We were using the Ice Age as an opportunity to build something better than what had existed before.